Letter of 1 Peter, chapter 5. If you were to consider your everyday relationships, you might think about the one you have with your spouse or significant other, or your interactions with your family, your children, siblings, parents, and then there's your friends, neighbors, and coworkers. God created us to live in a veritable tree of interconnected relationships with others. Peter, in his first chapter, implored Christians to have a deep and sincere love for each other. In chapter 2, he urged us to rid ourselves of those attitudes which form barriers between us and to join with others as living stones to form a spiritual house. He went on to show us what appropriate submission looks like between citizens and government authorities, slaves and masters, and wives and husbands. In chapter 3, Peter described the good life completely in terms of how we relate to others, reminding us in chapter 4 that our love for others covers a multitude of sins. So now it seems appropriate that Peter would conclude his letter with final thoughts on how we approach and interact with others. This is a very practical ending. We could outline chapter 5 in this way: relationships within the community, which includes elders to people, people to elders, and everyone to one another; relationship to God, relationship to Satan, and relationship to the wider Christian church. Within these contexts, let's take a look at these topics: elders, humility, exaltation, Satan, and oneness of the church. Peter first directs his attention to elders. Note that he is not creating a church office here. He presumes that the churches already have elders. What are elders? And what connection does this title have to do with other titles like pastors, deacons, bishops? Our church officially has a lead pastor, associate pastors, and elders. Having leaders called elders did not begin with the Christian church. Elders were common in the Old Testament. Their responsibilities included praying and inquiring of God, being resident historians, providing wise counsel, judging and exercising authority, and providing leadership for the people of Israel. In the New Testament church, the practice of having elders was continued. Elders are first mentioned in Acts 11. They have authority alongside of the apostles in Acts 15 and seem to have a primary leadership role by Acts 21. Early on, the apostle James indicates a role for church elders in healing the sick. The apostle Paul confirms the presence of elders in the multiple churches of Galatia, Philippi, Ephesus, and Crete. The Greek word for elder is presbyteros. Though the term can mean simply an older man, it generally implied a church leader. This was likely the title of an office rather than a description of seniority, though sometimes the distinction was unclear. One was not automatically an elder of the church because of age. Another New Testament term for church leader is episkopos, often translated bishop or overseer. It seems to connote the same office and authoritative function as presbyteros. The New Testament never makes clear a distinction between these, and Paul, on more than one occasion, used both terms to describe the same set of people. We should also note that elders or overseers were always plural. There is no early precedent for the church to be ruled by a single elder. Eldership was sometimes a paid position. Paul, in fact, felt that they should be fully compensated, commensurate with the quality of their work. Elders were in charge of the charity funds of the church. These two roles, paid leadership and stewardship of donations, tempted some to use their ministry for financial gain. And that is what Peter warns against in verse 2. Some will use the position wrongly for profit, prestige, and power. In the New Testament, there is a position in the church that is not an elder, that is diakonos or deacon. These were persons whose ministry it was to perform certain administrative tasks and to meet certain congregational needs. This office was established shortly after the church started, with Philip and Stephen being two notable examples. We should also note that these first deacons, Philip and Stephen, did much more than activities of service. They preached, evangelized, baptized, and prophesied. In modern Christian churches, we are apt to talk about the leader of the congregation as the pastor. Is that the same thing as an elder? In our church, the lead pastor is permanently one of the elders, but the associate pastors are not called elders. Perhaps that is a technicality more than anything else. The term pastor, poimen, which is used only once in the New Testament, implies a shepherding function, poimeno. A pastor is a steward of God's flock. Now, Peter says elders should shepherd the flock, thereby blurring any distinction between pastors and elders. Broadly, we would not be wrong to say elders as leaders, and bishops as overseers, and pastors as shepherds are all the same thing. In our passage, it is not Peter's goal to establish church administration or to define what titles people should have. His goal is to stress how those in leadership ought to relate to the rest of the congregation. And how should a leader relate to those in the congregation? Willingly, without selfish motives, with a servant mentality, in exemplary fashion. He is not to be in the ministry for the money, or the influence, or the fame. It did not come easily or naturally for Peter to be a humble servant of God. Remember, in the Gospels, there were times when he contradicted the Lord, and there were times when he regarded himself as superior to others. Peter's life was an example of one transformed by the Spirit as he yielded to God. If leaders are to lead with proper humility, so also are the younger church members to follow with proper humility. Younger here might mean younger in age, or newer in the faith, or less spiritually mature, irrespective of age. Regardless, it probably means both men and women. If we are to lead with humility and follow with humility, then humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God applies to everyone in the church. And so does the next phrase, that he may lift you up in due time. This is our living hope, our exaltation. Exaltation is a term that may seem somewhat foreign to the Christian, even though the word is found throughout the Bible. Or it may even make us feel uncomfortable. After what Peter has said about the humility we must have, how is it that he is now talking about our exaltation? We're reminded of a parable Jesus once told. Two men went to the temple to pray. The Pharisee proudly exalted himself. I'm glad I'm not like the sinners. But the tax collector said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This man went home justified before God. Humble and exalted may seem a contradiction in terms, but there's a sense in which it's not. Jesus exemplified both humility and exaltation. There's a time and place for these things. As Christians, we may look ahead to being exalted, but only if we start from the lowly posture of humility. This has been called the great eschatological reversal. At the second coming of Christ, the proper time, the last in this life, the humble, shall be first, while the first in this life, the proud, shall be last. Up until that time, we're reminded that the mark of a maturing Christian is humility. Life in Christ is a humble process of becoming. Peter brings up the evil one, the devil. Devil is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Satan. It means adversary or opponent. He is a liar and a tempter, always seeking to separate us from God. More than merely a force of evil, Satan is a spiritual creature with a distinct personality. He is described as the prince of this world, wielding power and influence on humanity in opposition to God. Sometimes sin starts with us, and Satan nurtures it along. Sometimes sin starts with Satan, and we yield to the temptation. It is the devil who fosters jealousy and ambition, offers a fake wisdom and a false faith, and brews a broth of discord and contention and murderous envy to sap the church's vitality and undermine its integrity. By the way, his name is not Lucifer, which is an invention of the King James Version of the Bible and not found in most modern Bible translations. Nor does he look like a Sith Lord in Star Wars. In fact, that is one of the real problems with Satan. He is not readily apparent. In the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis created an apprentice devil named Wormwood, who is assigned to plague a human subject whom he calls the patient. The underling spirit receives letters of advice from his satanic superior and uncle, Screwtape. Wormwood wonders if it is essential to keep the man in ignorance of his existence. The advice he gets is this: I do not think you will have much difficulty in keeping the patient in the dark. The fact that devils are predominantly comic figures in the modern imagination will help you. If any faint suspicion of your existence begins to arise in his mind, suggest to him a picture of something in red tights, and persuade him that since he cannot believe in that, he therefore cannot believe in you. Peter warns, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. He's saying, don't underestimate the influence of Satan in your life. Keep him in proper perspective, and you shall overcome him. Peter calls on us to do what he failed to do in the Garden of Gethsemane, to watch and pray. Roaring Satan is a tethered lion. He cannot tempt us beyond what we can endure, for God will not permit it. No temptation can overtake us that is not common to man, a temptation that has been overcome by others. We have what it takes to resist the devil and stand firm in the faith. Christians must resist. When they do, the devil will flee. Whatever power Satan may have, Christians can be absolutely certain that they have been given the ability to overcome that power. In Christianity, a distinction is made between local churches and the church. The local church is the one you attend on a regular basis, but we all belong to a much greater entity that is non-denominational and international. The universal church, sometimes spelled with a capital C, is composed of all true believers worldwide and united together by the Spirit in their common faith in Jesus Christ. The New Testament teaches that we are all one body. So Peter has the authority and responsibility to teach and exhort his fellow believers who live hundreds of miles away in Asia Minor. He is a part of their family, and they are under his shepherding. He reassures them, and the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. In his final greetings, Peter recognizes this fundamental unity with them. He cares about his suffering readers, and they care about him, and Silas, and Mark, and she who is in Babylon, which is the Roman Church. He ends with a sign of affection and shalom.